I've been involved in the debates, the global debates over globalization now for a decade and a half. An important and interesting question is how those debates have changed in that span of time. At the beginning of the 90s, there was enormous support for globalization, a belief that everybody, both in the developed and less developed countries, would benefit, the poorest would benefit, and the richest would benefit. Since then, globalization has united the world, but against it. In fact, one of the most important global movements has been the global movement against globalization, a global civil society movement involving hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. The question of those who believe that globalization would work is why has globalization generated such antipathy from both the developed and the less developed countries when both were supposed to benefit? Some people think that's a problem of psychiatry. The problem is that people are better off, but they just don't know it. And you then have to send a psychiatrist to make them realize that they are happier. But in fact, as we did economic studies at the World Bank and elsewhere, after the end of the last round of trade negotiations, the Uruguay round that was completed in 1994, we realized that many of the poorest countries of the world were actually made worse off. It wasn't just that they got a smaller share of the gains. Everybody expected the United States and Europe to get the largest share of the gains. But what actually happened is that the poorest countries in the world were worse off. And that was because of the asymmetric way in which globalization had proceeded. The advanced industrial countries demanded that the poorest countries open up their markets, eliminate their subsidies, but the advanced industrial countries did not fully reciprocate. In particular, in the area which is of most important to developing countries, agriculture, where 70% of the people live directly or indirectly off of agriculture. Europe, the United States, Japan kept their enormous subsidies, kept their markets closed, and the result of this was to lower the income of the poorest people in the world. The question then is, where is the globalization debate going today? We actually do know that the way it has been managed in the past has left the poorest worse off. And I think that constitutes the biggest change in the debate over globalization. We now realize that not everybody will automatically benefit, that globalization is a powerful force. It can lift the well-being and improve the living standards of those in both the advanced developed industrial countries and the poorest countries. But it hasn't been doing that. And so the challenge today is to make globalization work. How do we make it work? Well, to understand that, we have to understand some of the reasons and some of the ways in which globalization has not lived up to its promise. Well, if I were asked, what are the major failures of globalization? What are the major ways in which it has not lived up to its promise? There is actually a long list. One could begin, as I say, by talking about where it has not lived up to its promise. It was supposed to bring increased living standards everywhere in the world. In fact, some of the poorest people in the poorest countries have been made worse off. At one time, advocates of globalization believed that economic integration, financial market integration, would lead to greater stability, greater global economic stability. The IMF almost forced many of the countries of the world to take away their restrictions on short-term capital flows, opening up markets to destabilizing capital flows, arguing that it would lead to greater global economic stability. Well, they were wrong. And the global markets, global economy, has experienced enormous instability in recent years. And part of the reason is that the policies like capital market liberalization have been pushed too far and in ways without the appropriate safeguards that have actually contributed to instability. So this is an example where the promise was greater stability, the consequences have been greater instability. The same thing, as I said before, was true about trade liberalization. It was supposed to promote the well-being of all of the countries, but in fact, the poorest countries of the world have been left less well off. Now, globalization has many dimensions, and not just economics. Economic globalization is the part that we often focus on, and economic globalization has resulted in enormous benefits to a few countries in the world, to China, to India, who've experienced enormous economic growth. China has been growing for the last 30 years at over 9.5% a year. India has been growing for the last quarter century at over 5% of the year, and this year it's expected to grow at close to 8%. And though that growth has largely been based on globalization, on exports, but what these countries have done has been they've learned how to manage globalization for their own benefit. For instance, they did not open up their capital markets to destabilizing capital flows. And yet, they were able to get large amounts of foreign direct investment. China has been the largest recipient of foreign direct investment of any of the developing countries. So they were very careful in the way they managed globalization, so they were able to take advantage of the benefits without paying the cost. The region of the world which most succumbed to the dictates of globalization as it was managed by the Washington international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, was Latin America. There was a set of policies called the Washington Consensus Policies that involved minimizing the role of government, privatization, liberalization, focusing on inflation, not worrying about growth, not worrying about unemployment. And in fact, the result of this has been that the growth has been very disappointing. Growth in the 90s, the first decade of the Washington Consensus policies in Latin America, was just over half of what it had been in earlier decades of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Poverty has remained at a high level. In contrast to China, where they manage globalization correctly, and poverty has been reduced by hundreds of millions of people. Probably in history, there's been no period in which so many people have been moved out of poverty so rapidly. More than 300 million people in the span of 20 years. More people that live in the United States have moved out of poverty in that short span of time. So Latin America, in some sense, represents the failure of globalization when it's not well managed. East Asia represents the success of globalization when it is well managed. So first, China and the other East Asian countries took a very comprehensive approach to development. Secondly, they are a very balanced approach, making sure that jobs got created as jobs got destroyed, and understanding the many dimensions to these strategies. The third thing they did was they were very picky about what aspects of globalization were important and how to sequence it. So, for instance, China opened it up itself for foreign direct investment, but did not open itself up to short-term speculative capital flows because they said, we're not ready for it. Those flows are destabilizing. And they were right. So they got the foreign direct investment, which helped their economy grow, but they didn't have to pay the price of the destabilizing short-term capital flows. So they managed international globalization in a way to shape it for their own advantage. But as I said, there's more to globalization than just economic globalization. Globalization involves the movement as well of ideas, knowledge across borders, ideas about democracy, human rights. Those have spread around the world. Knowledge about how to extend life expectancy, greater improved health, has also led to an increase in life expectancy in both advanced industrial countries and the developing world.